Welcome to Llandaff Cathedral. Llandaff Cathedral claims a very ancient history. It's claimed to date back to 560, which is the period of the Celtic period, or even the Age of the Saints as it's known, and is associated with three Welsh Celtic saints, Dubrick, Tilo and Iwddofwi. However, the building that you see today dates only from 1120, when the bishop of the time, Bishop Urban, decided he wanted a bigger cathedral to replace the very small cathedral that he inherited. Now, parts of his cathedral have survived, but on the whole, it was rebuilt particularly in the 13th century when it was replaced with a building in the Gothic style, the early English Gothic style. Llandaff Cathedral has never, in fact, been a lucky cathedral. It's gone through various misfortunes. In the 15th century, Owain Glyndŵr committed a lot of damage, particularly to outlying buildings of the cathedral, and may in fact have also affected the main building itself. But rather more important, in the Reformation period, Llandaff Cathedral lost most of the lands that had supported it. As a result, the cathedral became extremely poor, and it was gradually allowed to fall into a greater and greater state of neglect, which reached its climax in the 18th century when the southwest tower collapsed, bringing down much of the roof of the cathedral. In the 1730s, there was perhaps in some ways rather unfortunate attempt to restore the building, but they only managed to get enough money to restore half the building. The rest was left to fall into greater ruin even more. In the 19th century, starting about 1840, money began to come into this area, and so money was raised to carry out a proper restoration of the cathedral. The architect involved in that was a local architect called John Pritchard, who decided to restore the building, to take away all the 18th century work, which had been in the classical style, and to restore the building as a proper Gothic church. And that work took nearly 30 years to complete, being completed, in fact, 1869 before that happened. However, the misfortunes of Llandaff Cathedral didn't stop there, because on January the 2nd, 1941, a bomb fell in the south churchyard, exploded, and brought down most of the roof, and Llandaff Cathedral became once again a roofless ruin. It was, in fact, the second most badly damaged cathedral in the whole of the British Isles, Coventry, of course, being the worst. Restoration of the building started in 1949, and at this time it was under control of an architect called George Pace. Now, Pace's principles was he would restore what could be restored, but anything new he added would be of the 20th century. That work was completed in 1960, when the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh came to the restoration service in the cathedral. The west front of Llandaff Cathedral is probably one of the most important parts of the cathedral and the most important posing parts of the cathedral. The centre gable is a very important part because it dates back to the first decade or so of the 13th century and is considered to be one of the finest examples of medieval religious architecture in the whole of Wales. Originally, that west gable was flanked by two towers, but the original towers have been replaced. The first one to go is the one on the left, which, for reasons we're not quite sure of, was replaced in the 15th century by the present tower, which we date normally from about 1485. It's called the Jasper Tower because it was paid for by Jasper Tudor, the uncle of Henry VII, the Lord of Glamorgan at that particular time. It is the bell tower of the cathedral and may well have been built to replace a bell tower which was destroyed by Owain Glyndŵr in the first part of the 15th century. Contains a ring of 12 bells, a very fine ring. The tower on the right-hand side is in fact the tower built in the 19th century as part of the restoration. The original medieval tower had collapsed in the course of the 18th century, and so in the 19th century restoration had to be replaced. And Pritchard decided to replace it with this 200-foot tower and spire, which adds a great deal of dignity and impressiveness to the cathedral. It was completed in 1869. Now standing in front of the St. Dubrick Chapel in the cathedral, which was created after the last war during the course of the post-war restoration. It is a chapel that is a memorial chapel to the 53rd Welsh Infantry Division, but it is important because it houses probably the second most important work of art in the cathedral. This is a painting by Gable, which was the first commission that he had ever received. It was commissioned in 1856 to go behind the high altar of the Victorian cathedral, but that was not a suitable location for it in the post-war restoration scheme, and so it was moved to this side chapel. The painting looks at first sight like a simple nativity, but it is a more complex picture than that. It's called the Seed of David, and what Rossetti was intending to show was Christ in the centre panel being worshipped by rich and by poor. In other words, a shepherd boy and the king. The panels on the right and the left show, in fact, stages of King David's life, and Christ was considered to be a descendant of David. So Christ is descended also from rich and poor, inasmuch as King David went through the phase of being a poor shepherd and also a rich king. Standing in the nave of the cathedral, one of obviously the most important parts of the cathedral, but also in its way, almost a potted history of the cathedral. At the far end, you can see one of the remaining arches of Bishop Urban's cathedral. But the main nave arcade, these pointed arch running down there, are from a later rebuilding of the cathedral in the Middle Ages and date, in fact, from the beginning of the 13th century, and again are considered to be a very fine example of early English nave arcading. On the other hand, if we then move higher, above the nave arcade, we have the clerestory. Now, the clerestory, in fact, dates from the 19th century. They are the work of Pritchard, John Pritchard. However, what he found was there was one little section of the medieval clerestory surviving, and he used that as a model for the whole of the clerestory, which he restored. So, in fact, again, it is probably a good example of what the clerestory looked like in the medieval period. If we go even higher, we're to the post-war period. This is the work of George Pace, this flat wooden ceiling that you have there. He replaced what John Pritchard had provided, in fact, an open timber roof, but it was felt to be very cavernous, and that the flat ceiling was probably what was there in the Middle Ages. So once more, it is probably a fair idea of what was there in the Middle Ages. In the middle, you can see the most obvious example of George Pace's work, namely the Pulpitum, which he constructed. This aroused controversy at the time, and has continued to arouse controversy because its obvious difference from the surrounding stonework. But Pace was convinced that anything he added had to be of the 20th century. And so he made use of reinforced concrete to build this. The consulting engineer for that was Ove Arup, who was the architect of the Sydney Opera House. We're now standing in the David Chapel of Llandaff Cathedral, also known as the Royal Welsh Chapel. This was built in the early years of the 1950s as part of the post-war restoration of the cathedral, but it was paid for by the Welsh Regiment, which was the Cardiff Regiment, and is a memorial to the Welsh Regiment. So you will see its emblem all over the place. And in addition, we have the battle honours of the Welsh Regiment, some of the colours of the Welsh Regiment. But particularly interesting, the stained glass window over there, which is the oldest stained glass in the cathedral, dating from the end of the 15th, early 16th century. Behind me, you can see one of the oldest parts of the cathedral, a doorway which probably dates from 1120, the year of the foundation, therefore is part of Bishop Urban's cathedral. It is a very fine example of a Romanesque or Norman doorway. It was originally, we think, the west door of Urban's cathedral, but was moved round to the side in the later rebuilding of his cathedral. When George Pace erected the Pulpitum, right from the beginning, he said that this would be the opportunity of having an important work of religious art from the 20th century. After a lot of discussion, it was decided to ask Jacob Epstein to do that statue. He was commissioned to do the statue in 1953, and the statue was first revealed to the public at the rehallowing of the nave in 1957. Epstein designed this work to show Christ in majesty, Christ after his resurrection in heaven, and really appearing as a king and even a judge. The figure is stylized in a sense, namely the body is very straightforward, disguised by a long, simple gown, but the hands, the face, and the feet were very realistically modeled, quite intentionally, to draw attention to these things. A former dean used to say, "Those are feet that walk the earth. Those are hands reaching out to the earth. That is a face looking out at the world in justice and in mercy." I think a very good summary of it. The statue is in fact made of unpolished aluminium. It's 16 feet high, twice life-size, but only weighs 700 weight. It is considered to be the major work of art in Llandaff Cathedral. We are now in the choir of the cathedral. The choir, of course, is where the choir sings, but it's also the chapter seats are here. Now, the Victorians had provided the cathedral with very elaborate chapter choir stalls, but unfortunately, when the bomb went off just outside the windows, much of that was so badly damaged that it could not be restored. And so the choir stalls are the work, in fact, of George Pace. But he made use of parts of the Victorian choir stalls, or in this case the chapter stalls, for where he could. And so the chapter stalls are, in fact, rescued bits of the Victorian. The one part of the Victorian arrangement was the bishop's throne, which is, in fact, a very fine example of Victorian woodwork, and it is, in fact, very much as it was. Now, if we move on from the choir to the sanctuary beyond it, where you see the thing that dominates there is, in fact, the great Norman arch, one of the finest remaining parts of Bishop Urban's cathedral of 1120, and is one of the oldest parts, obviously, of the modern building, and it is considered to be a very fine example of Romanesque art here. Up above it, the work up above was the work of Pritchard, but in the middle in particular is an important piece of modern stained glass, the work of John Piper working with Patrick Rentians, of course the same team that worked on Coventry Cathedral. What it depicts is in the supper at Emmaus, and again is considered to be a splendid example of John Piper's work. We're now in the Dubrick chapel of the cathedral, which has a number of features that are quite interesting. Behind me, you can see what was formerly the reredos behind the high altar of the medieval cathedral. This dates from the middle of the 14th century, but then in the rebuilding in the Victorian periods, it was found to be so badly damaged that it was simply removed and placed in the side of this chapel. Behind the altar is the reredos, which again has its interest, namely that it's composed of tiles made in the 1890s in the Della Robbia factory, which was set up to produce works of art for the pre-Raphaelite movement. So that it was designed by Burne-Jones, and the angel is based upon Elizabeth Siddal, one of the favorite models of the pre-Raphaelites. It depicts the 6 days of the creation. Also in this chapel, because originally this chapel was known as the Matthew Chapel, we have 2 very good alabaster monuments for the Matthew family, who were local landowners who had the right of burial in it. There is the statue of Sir David Matthew, virtually the founder of the family, and on the other side, Sir Christopher Matthew. We're now in the Lady Chapel of the cathedral, which is of interest because it was built probably in the 1280s and was built by the bishop who is buried in the corner, Bishop William de Breus. The interest is that, having been built in 1280, it's the sole part of the cathedral which is relatively unaltered from then, and also the only part that has been in constant use since then, since other parts were taken out of commission by bombing or decay or other things. It's very interesting as well because the vaulted ceiling of this chapel is in fact the original vaulting of the Middle Ages and is a very good example of early English vaulting. The decoration of this chapel was all done by a gentleman called Webb, and it started before the First World War when he did the wall painting of this chapel, and then afterwards, during the course of the period between the wars, he started to provide stained glass windows. This carried on after the war and was only finally completed in the 1950s. The chapel has got a very interesting reredos to it, dating in fact from the 14th century.